Hello, and welcome to another episode of Earth911's Sustainability in Your Ear, the podcast conversation with a change maker working to accelerate the transition to a sustainable carbon neutral society. I'm your host, Mitch Ratcliffe. You know, we've got a question today. That is, are the laws of the United States fitted for sustainability? Our guest, attorney Maya van Rossum, is an adjunct professor and director of the Environmental Law Clinic at Temple's Beasley School of Law, and she's also the founder of Green Amendments for the Generation. She argues that it's time for a new approach to environmental constitutionalism. Our evolving insights into the uneven health, economic, racial, and social impacts of climate change demand that we rethink our approach to legislation and the Constitution to enable the creation of laws and policies that will make a tangible difference for future generations, not just the voters who are alive today. The second edition of her book, The Green Amendment, The People's Fight to Secure a Clean, Safe, and Healthy Environment, will be published by Disruption Books on November 1st, 2022. Maya's influence recently contributed to New York adding a Green Amendment to its constitution. It's the first state to do so since Pennsylvania and Montana, which added constitutional language in the 1970s that requires, quote, each person shall have a right to clean air and water and a healthful environment, unquote. The text sounds simple, but it's also full of implications for the law and each of us to consider. It raises questions about the state of U.S. politics today. We also wanted to ask Maya about the United States Supreme Court's recent ruling in West Virginia versus the Environmental Protection Agency that limits the EPA's ability to enforce the Clean Air Act and other laws. You can learn more about Maya and Green Amendments for the Generations at www.forthegenerations.org. For the Generations has no space, no dash, forthegenerations.org. Hello, Maya. Welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
Thanks so much for having me, Mitch. I'm really excited to be here.
Well, it's great to have you, and thanks for taking the time. You know, I want to start off by asking about your background. You're an attorney, and you've also been involved with Delaware River Keepers for a long time. You're a leader there. How did your involvement with protecting the Delaware River connect you to this critique of U.S. politics and policymaking that you've launched?
So I've actually had the honor of being the Delaware Riverkeeper for nearly 30 years now and leader of the four-state organization. And amongst the many issues that we have taken on over the years is to defend the Delaware River from fracking for fossil fuels, fracking for gas from shale that is very prevalent in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And we have actually been very successful. In fact, there's no fracking anywhere within the boundaries of the Delaware River watershed, largely because of the leadership of the Delaware Riverkeeper Network. But that does not mean that fracking is not happening in watershed states outside of the boundaries of the watershed, sure, notably the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, I have very much, and my organization very much has the belief that fracking anywhere is bad for all of us everywhere. And so while we have been able to protect our watershed, you know, we remain concerned about fracking that happens in other sections of our watershed states and also elsewhere in the nation, and have used our experience and expertise to help communities battle that back. Now, in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, outside of the boundaries of the watershed, I'm sure people are very aware that fracking has really advanced at quite a clip over the years. And despite that fact, despite how easy under our current system of laws at the state level and the federal level it has been for the Pennsylvania frackers to advance their industrial operations, devastating communities and our environment in order to frack for gas from shale, the frackers wanted to find a way to make it even easier for themselves. And so way back in 2012, we had kept fracking. Already at that point, we had prevented fracking from coming into the watershed. But outside the watershed, again, the frackers were trying to find a way to really grease the wheels for them to continue to advance their operations at even a higher rate and pace. And so they very literally wrote for themselves a law that came to be known as Act 13 that was passed by the Pennsylvania legislature in 2012. And what this law did was it put in place things like automatic waivers from environmental protection standards. It preempted local zoning authorities. So while municipalities were able to limit industrial operations to certain segments of their community, keeping it, for example, out of residential districts, this law said that that was prohibited when it came to fracking, and that actually fracking operations were mandated to be allowed to advance in the heart of residential communities. So, while fracking was already bad in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, fracking was about to get a whole lot worse. And again, that would really up the pressure for advancing fracking in our watershed. And of course, again, it would contaminate waterways and our environments and continue to destabilize the climate in a way that's devastating for all of us. I believe very much in litigation. And so the Delaware Riverkeeper Network is one of the few organizations that litigates. So when that law was passed, I and my organization decided that we had to find a way to defeat it, that we had to challenge it legally. The thing is, how do you challenge a law that's been passed by a legislature and signed by a governor? There aren't too many options.
Well, so that's the question. How does adding a constitutional amendment that says each person shall have a right to clean air and water in a healthful environment change that situation? Because on the one hand, you have been successful within the watershed, but then we know that at the greater level that we don't have a legal system built to enforce the protection of the environment and ourselves from these intrusions on our health. How does the constitutional language change the setting?
Yeah, so you're rightfully hopping to the punchline, which is awesome. So when we were thinking about our strategy for how to defeat this law, one of the things we did was hearken back to a long ignored environmental rights amendment that was actually placed in the Bill of Rights section of the Pennsylvania Constitution years before, that recognized that the people of Pennsylvania have a constitutional right to pure water, clean air, and a healthy environment. And we decided that while that amendment had been ignored for literally 4 decades by that point, that maybe this law was such an egregious overreach by the industry and by their friends in the legislature that maybe we could get the Pennsylvania Supreme Court to overturn that 4 decades of bad precedent and use this constitutional environmental right to defeat the law before it even started to inflict its devastating impacts. And long story short, that's exactly what we accomplished. We, along with 7 municipalities, challenged provisions in Act 13 as being an unconstitutional violation of the environmental rights of the people of Pennsylvania. And therefore, those aspects of the law should be declared unconstitutional, defunct, and never allowed to be applied. And the very conservative Pennsylvania Supreme Court actually agreed with us. And so we defeated those devastating provisions of the law before they ever took effect. And equally as important, we breathed legal life into this long ignored constitutional right to a clean and healthy environment for all the people of Pennsylvania.
Now, Pennsylvania and Montana passed their green amendments back in the 70s at the dawn of the environmental era. And apparently Montana was a much bluer place at the time. You recently helped pass this law and added it to the New York State Constitution. How many states are involved in this discussion right now? And is there real momentum starting to build around this idea?
So that's such an important aspect of this conversation, because after, we achieved our victory in 2013, I literally did look at every constitution across our nation and found that only one other state, as you said, Montana, lifted up environmental rights to this highest constitutional standing, putting environmental rights on par with the other fundamental freedoms we hold dear, like free speech and freedom of religion. And I decided, when I figured that out, that I was going to change that, right? And secure this kind of amendment, what I now call a green amendment, in every state across our nation. Because it's important to understand that actually most state constitutions talk about the environment and even talk about environmental rights, but only Pennsylvania and Montana, and now New York, because of our success there last year, actually put environmental rights on par with those other fundamental freedoms. So we had Pennsylvania and Montana that had environmental rights amendments when I started this movement. We successfully worked in the state of New York and got a constitutional green amendment passed last year in 2021. And we are working now in over a dozen other states across the nation, literally, seeking to advance constitutional environmental rights at this highest level by passing green amendments.
Now, you seem to be making a lot of progress in New Mexico in particular. Are there other states where people should be paying attention to this and maybe getting their legislator involved in the conversation?
I think that we have made the most progress to date in New Jersey, in Delaware, and Delaware is more recently, New Mexico, Maine, Washington State. There's tremendous progress in the state of Hawaii. And there's really powerful growing interest in the state of Michigan. And in the state of Florida, they're advancing the Green Amendment movement, but in a different way, in a more step-by-step approach, focusing on clean water first and going to add other aspects of the environment later, because as I really talk about in my book, it's really important that the language in green amendments and the strategy used to secure them really suit the unique personalities of every state where we're working. And Florida, as many people know, for a lot of political reasons, has a very different personality on a lot of fronts. And so strategically,
you could call it unique. Yeah,
we could call it unique. So in Florida, we're using this step-by-step strategy because that's what's going to work best in Florida. But in every other state, the language is very powerful, recognizing and protecting rights to clean water, clean air, stable climate, healthy environments, including the rights of future generations.
Well, now let's talk a little about the definitions, because the principles are clear and I think self-evident. Everybody should have these rights. But what is clean air, and how do we define clean water and a healthful environment? And the reason I ask this question is that we tend to look to experts for this. So how democratic can technical issues involved in a complex relationship between humans, nature, the economy, communities, all the things that we talked about, be legislated democratically rather than technocratically?
So first and foremost, advancing a constitutional green amendment is about as democratic as it gets when it comes to protecting the environment.
But after that, once you start applying it, it's almost always, there are certainly exceptions, but almost always comes down to science and technology for measurement, so that we can say, yes, we really do believe things are clean now or safe. So and I think that's one of the problems that we have as a society right now, is that what we're tackling as a society is so much more complex than what we used to, and we have to depend more on expertise to do so.
So I'm going to say yes and say no. So
okay.
I mean, yes, science has a very important place in environmental protection, as do, our regulatory agencies and outside experts that have critical expertise to help us when it comes to environmental protection. And we want good, sound science to inform environmental protection and good legal decision-making. The truth is that is not what happens right now. In fact, science is often disregarded, recrafted, set aside, ignored by our government officials. And that's actually one of many problems with our current legal system. But one of the things that a green amendment does is it actually obligates the government to truly engage in what we call informed decision-making. So that means that they actually have to demonstrate, when they're engaged in environmental decision-making, they have to demonstrate that they actually did consider the science. That they did consider cumulative impacts, already existing conditions on the ground. What are communities already suffering from when it comes to pollution and degradation? And what is this new government decision going to foist upon that already existing condition? Is it going to make it better? Is it going to make it worse? Is it going to make it seriously worse? Do we already have environmental sacrifice zones that are going to be sacrificed yet again to another highly polluting industrial operation? Under our current laws, a lot of those things don't have to be considered or
Right.
when it comes to things like environmental sacrifice zones are actually very acceptable under our current system of laws. But under the Constitution,
Right.
government officials actually do have to demonstrate that they appropriately considered those things and responded to them. And when they can't make that demonstration, it can actually become a reason for a successful constitutional challenge, which is very powerful.
Absolutely. And I believe in the value of litigation as well. But here, let me point out a particular issue. The state law language talks about a healthful environment. The proposed federal law talks about a stable climate. How do we define a stable climate? And this actually is where do we set the starting point? Which, of course, is an expert-led conversation, because it would be very easy for somebody, say a large fossil fuel company, to say, well, we'll keep the stable climate where it is today, rather than going back to the stable climate in which we actually evolved. So how do we have those discussions at a political level where democratic activity is fully realized while simultaneously hewing to the science?
So there are a couple of ways to come at this, right? And you sort of started in the middle of the conversation. But I'm going to take us a little bit back to the beginning of the conversation.
I do that a lot. Don't worry about it.
No, and that's great. And that's great. And in fact, this question of what is clean water? What is clean air? What is a stable climate? That is actually one of the first questions that our opposition raises. It's one of the first points that the fossil fuel industry makes in order to defeat Green Amendment proposals, because they actually don't, as we can imagine, they don't actually want to see them advanced and passed, because like we had with that piece of legislation in Pennsylvania, a Green Amendment can be a really powerful tool that to help challenge inappropriate government action, where otherwise there would be no way to address it absent, protest or the next election. Sure. So when that question gets asked, I have two responses. The first is, well, what is free speech? What is freedom of religion? What is an unreasonable search and seizure that rises to an unconstitutional level? The truth is that the Bill of Rights provisions of our Constitution, and that's where a Green Amendment must be housed in order to give environmental rights that highest constitutional standing. It has to be in the Bill of Rights section of our state constitutions. But that language is all intentionally broad. So we actually can cover the range of issues that are associated with whatever that fundamental freedom is, in this case, the environment. So we need broad language to ensure that all laws, all regulations, all permitting, all decision-making can be captured. All industrial operations, whether or not we can foresee them being created decades down the line or not, right? Like fracking. Fracking is not something we knew about decades ago. So we need that broad language to be able to be all-encompassing and to make sure that government is held accountable across the gambit. The next step is that, in fact, that language gets defined the same way other broad language in the Bill of Rights section gets defined. In the first instance, it does get defined by our government officials. It does get defined by the legislature, by the regulatory agencies. It does get defined when it's used in action to permit some sort of business operation or prohibit it. And when we, the people, think that the government is appropriately using the science and considering all the issues and protecting our environment and protecting our communities, we then let their laws go through and their regulations go through, and that process advances. And every time that process advances, we get a little bit more definition about what is clean water and what is clean air. But when we, the people, can say, look, when you look at the cumulative impacts already existing on the ground that are devastating the lives of a community that's going to be further impacted by this industrial operation spewing pollution into the air, or when we bring forth independent science, not science brought forth by the industrial operators or their friends in the legislature, but we bring forth independent science, peer-reviewed science that demonstrates that, in fact, this action or activity will have serious serious health consequences for our environment, for species, for the climate, we can then, because we have a constitutional right to clean water, clean air, a stable climate, and healthy environments, we can then actually gain access to the courts. And based on that information and other claims, challenge that law, that action, or that decision, and bring the courts into the process. And then the courts use their principles of interpretation to help us ferret it out and add additional definition by supporting or refuting whatever government decision we are challenging. And then in that context, we get a little bit more understanding. And over time, we build blocks of understanding about what it means to have a clean, safe, and healthy environment. It takes time, but it works.
That's the challenge in this highly mediated environment that we live in now, is that there's this, what happened in the last 5 minutes? I need to know. And the lack of that progress or perceived progress, because I agree that the long, slow historical perspective is critical to understanding where we're actually going, is always very challenging to see and understand. I mean, for me, it became clear for a variety of reasons, but in particular, because down the hall from my room at my dorm in college, the police seized some marijuana and the kid ended up in front of the Supreme Court and won. And when you see that happen, you go, wow, this is how ordinary life translates into better law. And it's really inspiring. But I want to talk more about the idea of standing. We want to take a quick commercial break first. We'll be right back. We're back to continue the conversation with attorney Maya van Rossum. She's author of the Green Amendment, The People's Fight to Secure a Clean, Safe, and Healthy Environment. So Maya, we were just talking about standing and having the opportunity as individuals to participate in the litigation of our future. Now, the EPA recently lost a lot of the teeth it had to enforce the the Clean Air Act in West Virginia versus EPA. And so it seems to me that in some sense, our opportunity to find a place from which to sue is being eroded. And this is clearly a long-term effort on the part of a segment of society. Let's just put it that way. Are there more opportunities or less for activists to get involved and make a change today, particularly where the court is?
So you are 100% right. It is a big strategy of those who are not concerned about environmental pollution and degradation and actually see it as a hindrance to, advancing their personal political goals or private profit goals. And they are trying to increasingly limit access to the courts so that people can challenge inappropriate government action and decision making. So yes, concerted strategy. A constitutional green amendment really helps us. Right now, in order to gain access to the courts to challenge a law, action, or decision that's taken place, you actually have to turn to the law written by the legislators to know whether or not you're entitled to go to court. Mm-hmm. Well, when it comes to the Constitution, when we all have a constitutional right to clean water, clean air, a stable climate, or healthy environments, when we can show that government action is going to take from us that constitutional right, we get immediate access to the courts based on the Constitution. We don't have to find a provision in the Clean Water Act or the state version of the Clean Water Act that says you can go to court to challenge this kind of permit or that kind of action. We can actually turn to the Constitution and say that our right to clean water has been infringed upon by what's happening here, and then we can get access to the courts on constitutional grounds.
So like the free speech comparison you made earlier, what is not necessarily important. It's the fact that we can talk about it in the broadest context of the Constitution.
100%. The thing is, too, the important thing to know, not only do our current laws dictate, the laws written by the legislators dictate when, how, where we can gain access to the courts when we have a problem, when we are being harmed by what government officials are doing. But fundamentally, at its core, our current system of environmental protection laws, supposed environmental protection laws, are really not focused on preventing pollution, degradation, or harm. They're really focused on legalizing it. It is not illegal to pollute our water, our air. It is not illegal to create environmental sacrifice zones where communities of color or indigenous communities or low-income communities are repeatedly and consistently targeted for highly polluting industrial operations, literally to sacrifice them in order to protect the more affluent communities down the way. None of that's illegal. You just have to read the right law, get the right reviews, and get the appropriate permitting. And then so that your government officials are literally giving you permission, literally legalizing the pollution and degradation you want to undertake. They might tweak it a little bit here or there, but fundamentally, it's all about what are the right permits, not how do we prevent the harm in the first instance. And that's where a constitutional green amendment really transforms this system, because fundamentally, because we, the people, have a constitutional right to a clean, safe, and healthy environment, that is the priority when it comes to government action and decision making. And so whenever government is going to act in a way that may infringe on our environmental rights, just like if they're going to act in a way that might infringe on free speech rights or gun rights or private property rights, the first thing they have to do is take a step back and say, how can I advance this government action in a way that will avoid infringement on the right? When it comes to the environment, that means avoid pollution and degradation first, not hop to the end of the process and say, what's going to be the right permit?
Now, you just hit on an important point, which is the contention between different communities, particularly those focused on private property and those focused on their health and just getting by. A significant feature of the thinking that I've read from you is that we have the opportunity to resolve historic injustices, particularly the theft of so much land from indigenous peoples. But the question now is, how do we find a path forward where those contending communities fighting over the resources can get together and move forward together? Because again, I think that's another issue our society is battling right now, is inequity is so comprehensive that we can no longer have a reasonable conversation. So how do we find that reasonable starting point for a conversation?
Well, sometimes we're going to be able to find a reasonable starting point, and sometimes we're not, because as we know, right, there are a lot of unreasonable people. And so we sort of have to be able to tell the difference between the two. But I think one of the interesting things in this constitutional context, disturbing things, is the inequity on the basis of rights that allows for the inequity in terms of the outcomes when it comes to the environment. The truth is, right now, people have private property rights. So if you are a property owner, if you're a big business that owns a property, and you want to do a massive development or an industrial operation on that property, you go forth, you get your reviews, you're seeking your permits. You don't like the decision that let's say the local municipality is about to render to say, no, you can't do that. Or you can't do that in that place, that space, that way that you want to. What is the first thing we see from those business operations, those property owners? They say, oh, if you say no to me, I'm going to challenge you for violating my constitutional private property rights. I'm going to call it a takings, and you're now going to have to pay me big bucks if you try to say no. And what that really does is it scares off the decision makers from making an appropriate decision they want to. And there is no counterbalance to that kind of claim. But when you have a green amendment, when everybody else in the community has a constitutional right to clean water, clean air, for example, then when that industrial operation or that big development is proposing their activity that is going to infringe on the environmental rights of the people around, now the government officials have a response when there's that claim of takings or that threat of a takings claim. They can say, wait a second, yours are not the only rights we have to protect. We also have to protect the environmental rights of everybody around. And so we now start to have a counterbalance to the decision-making process, which can also provide a valuable balance before we ever get to that debate. When businesses and government officials start to recognize that they too have to respect and protect environmental rights, then they're more eager to come to the conversation before we get to litigation, because they understand that there is now a constitutional argument against them where before there wasn't.
Do you then see more trade-offs being offered? So there may be these sacrifice zones. And by the way, I'm not advocating for this, but I'm just trying to lay it out. There may be sacrifice zones. And on the other hand, offers of more green cover in low-income urban areas as a trade-off. And is that where we're going to see some form of coalescing of a direction where we understand that we're simply trying to make improvements in all of our lives? That's the problem.
Yeah. See, and I don't see us hopping there. And I definitely don't see a Green Amendment taking us down that path. And I don't see a Green Amendment taking us down that path for, as always, a couple of reasons. The first off, the individuals living in those sacrifice zones, they have an individual constitutional right to a clean and healthy environment. And that right has to be protected. It has to be protected. And so there cannot be an excuse that, well, in order to protect the environmental rights of another segment of the population, large, small, or otherwise, we're going to have to continue to sacrifice you. That simply doesn't work. I mean, think about that in the speech context. Think about that in the civil rights context. You would never say it is okay to go into communities of color. They do it, but you would not say that it is constantly okay, constitutionally okay, to simply rush in to the homes of Black and brown people to search for whatever it is you want to search for, because somehow that's going to result in protecting the civil rights of other people. You wouldn't, because those individuals have an individual right to the sanctity of their homes, to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures. So you don't hop to this, we're going to do a trade-off of your rights for their rights. What you hop to is, how are we going to approach this situation, this industrial operation, in a way that is not going to infringe on anybody's rights?
I understand and agree with what you said. Now, the problem is that's an excellent legal argument and description, but the real politics of our environment, of our country, are very different. So, is the main problem that I want to hone in on a solution? Is money in politics the main problem here? Is there just so much money flowing right now to protect those absurdly restricted private property rights, or expressed property rights, over the health of everyone that's going to be impacted by the behavior of an entity on the property it owns? Because that's the problem. It's pollution is not point pollution at the facility. It's that it spreads everywhere. And so how do we find a politics where we have the discussions and acknowledge these exchanges, because that's really what we're doing, in some rational way that we can all get on board with?
So the truth is, money and political access is 100% the problem today. And it is the reason why we have a system of laws focused on accepting pollution and degradation and legalizing it, rather than a system that's focused on protecting clean and safe and healthy environments for all people. And one of the reasons why we have been allowed to see a political process that so blatantly abuses our environment and abuses certain segments of our community is because there is not a legal constitutional counterbalance. So they can get away with it time and time and time again. Now, a Green Amendment is not going to be an instant panacea for environmental protection, but it is very quickly going to start leveling the playing field. And I just want to give a few examples right now. And we have to remember, yes, pollution spreads, but it spreads from a source. And so if we can stop the pollution at the source, we can also protect those immediately adjacent communities. But then we also do have that broader community protection and benefit. Like that Act 13 case, that pro-fracking law I talked about. If that law had been allowed to go in play, we would have had individual fracking operations spreading exponentially across the Commonwealth in places and spaces where they would not have been allowed before. That would have harmed those living within those communities, but it also would have exacerbated tremendously the climate crisis, air pollution, et cetera. And so by preventing that law, we stopped those industrial fracking operations in all of those locations, which had that bigger scale benefit. We've seen the Green Amendment protect the drinking water supplies of entire communities because there was an agreement, for example, in the state of Montana, there was a proposal for water test well drilling between two individual parties, which if the government had been required to advance that test well drilling, the ramification would have been the entire town of Bozeman's drinking water supply could have been contaminated. So by giving constitutional power in that more localized context, we actually prevented the broader community from harm. And we have example after example after example of how the Green Amendment has provided this kind of powerful local and big scale protection in Pennsylvania and Montana. And we've only had living, thriving, breathing Green Amendments in those states for a relatively short period of time. And already we are seeing powerful steps in setting critical precedent that really is providing otherwise out of reach protections.
So it sounds like states really can make this progress individually and by banding together to work toward bringing this right to fruition for everybody. Is California's example of setting very aggressive environmental and pollution standards the right way for states and for citizens within states to start thinking about their political leverage to change the direction with regard to climate change?
Well, yes and no, because, California suffers the same kind of problems as everybody else. I mean, sure. Fracking has all kinds of power in the state of California, right? They get all kinds of water and they get all kinds of exemptions, despite the fact that everybody else is suffering when it comes to, drought conditions and water quality conditions. We have environmental sacrifice zones in California, just like everywhere else.
Absolutely.
Because in California, just like everywhere else, we have this focus on, as you said, that flawed political system, and there is no higher check on that, on the power of government that is held by the people. So yes, we definitely want people to be involved in the political process in order to secure more protective legislation and regulations, and having a constitutional right that we, the people and legislators, can ground that more aggressive protection in is very, very beneficial. But we also need the people of California, like every other state, to seek and secure this constitutional protection so that when that political system goes awry, when it puts in place gaps in the laws or loopholes, or gives primary or accepts environmental racism, or gives primary power to the legislature, the state legislature versus everybody else, that the people have the ultimate check because they have the constitutional right.
So how can our listeners support the move to the Green Amendment in their state? And here's another question. Should they be asking their city council to put these kinds of rules in place in order just to bubble the problem up by expressing the fact that this community will not tolerate environmental degradation?
Well, I think it's always helpful to, get better protections at the local level, but part of the problem there is that's only going to have benefit in your local town. It does not have the same kind of power or benefit as a constitutional amendment, because if the state government, like we saw in Pennsylvania, wants to preempt that local authority and force local government to do bad environmental stuff, the state government has the power to do that absent that overarching constitutional Green Amendment. And I know you know that, but your listeners might not know that.
Right. Well, so what can they do? What can they do today? When they finish this podcast, they're going to want to do something. I'm going to want to do something. What should I do?
So there are three things that you should do. Number one, you should go to the website, www.forthegenerations.org, because the organization is Green Amendments for the Generation. So forthegenerations.org. Find out whether or not we have a Green Amendment advancing in your state. And if so, through our website, get involved. And if you don't have a Green Amendment advancing in your state, but you want to be part of making that happen, then immediately get in touch with us, which you can do very easy via the online platform, or you can email me or call me, and I personally will talk to you and we will make it happen. And we will work together, just like we've done in the states where the movement is growing, to bring more people, more voices to the table, get them educated, have them join you in advocating for a constitutional environmental right. And lest you think, I'm just one person, man, I can't make it happen in my state. Well, let me assure you that two of our most powerful Green Amendment movements in New Mexico and Maine both started because one person read my book, The Green Amendment, and called me. And in the other instance, one person heard me on a show like this, and after the show called me. And I had a personal conversation, and we worked together to figure out how to start and grow the movement. And like I said, Maine and New Mexico are two of the most powerful, inspirational Green Amendment movements we have going, because one person decided that they wanted to make it happen in their state, and they partnered up with me and Green Amendments for the Generations, and we worked together to make it happen.
Well, Maya, that's an inspiring answer. Thank you. I want to thank you also for taking the time to talk with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I hope that people have been inspired, because after 30 years of environmental activism, I can tell you our current system of environmental protection laws are fundamentally flawed. And I truly, truly, truly believe this is a powerful pathway to transform the current system and really make a difference.
Well, thank you. We've been speaking with Maya van Rossum. She's the author of The Green Amendment, The People's Fight to Secure a Clean, Safe, and Healthy Environment. The second edition of the book will be published by Disruption Books on November 1st, 2022. And take a minute to visit Green Amendments for the Generations. That's at www.forthegenerations.org. For the Generations has no spaces, no dashes, forthegenerations.org. And find out whether or not your state has an amendment in the works. I think the key idea we heard today is simple, but it's a very changeable truth. We've made it legal to pollute, sometimes after jumping through a few hoops, but legal to pollute almost anywhere in the United States. A Green Amendment isn't a silver bullet, but it can be the yeast to activate a vibrant legal and political discussion that over time can lead to significant changes. We need to take a long view, even though we have a short window to act to avoid the worst of climate change. That means that you, me, and everyone we know needs to be involved. And you can start by visiting forthegenerations.org, or by sharing this podcast with your friends, family, and community to begin a conversation. Be bold. Call Maya at Green Amendments for the Generations and start a movement where you are. As we heard, it can take just one person to get a debate going. I also hope you'll take a moment to share this show or dig into our archive of hundreds of interviews. You can find Sustainability in Your Ear on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Audible, and other fine purveyors of podcast goodness. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe, your host. We'll be back with another innovator interview from Earth911 soon. In the meantime, folks, take care of yourself, take care of one another, and let's all take care of this beautiful planet of ours. Have a green day.